David Goa, please introduce yourself.
I've been the director of the Chester Ryan Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life at the University of Alberta. Taught religious studies and philosophy for many years now.
So you've taught theology and philosophy combined.
Well, religious studies is usually not, I view theology as part of religious studies, although many don't. But I certainly have a great regard for theological traditions and teach in that sphere as well as in the broader religious studies sphere.
Fascinating. Okay. Anyways, on today's topic, we'll be asking the question, faith in the modern age. Most of the religious traditions we have today are at the youngest, they're still hundreds of years old. Some of these traditions go back thousands of years. What is the value of modern theology in the modern day? I mean, we're no longer nomads in the desert. We live in the industrial age or the technological age. So really, what is the value of these ancient texts in the modern day?
Well, you've asked a half a dozen questions all in one there.
Mm-hmm.
Let me peel them back a little bit. It's important to remember that not everybody lives the way we live.
Mm-hmm.
There are nomads in the world. There are people that live quite similar to the way they lived thousands of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But it is certainly true that the modern world has come to spread across through many, many countries and tends to be dominant in our time. So I think there's a couple distinct questions here. The one that you initially started with is faith. What is the meaning of faith in the modern world? And then you went to the whole question of these religious traditions that have been around for a long time. The Sikh tradition is certainly the youngest of the very large religious traditions. With that second question, what is the value in the modern world of the big basket that a religious tradition has? Text of various kinds, image, ritual, a way to shape time and space. All of those elements are part of it. Well, the modern world is also a world in which human beings are trying to make sense out of life.
Right.
And they do this in a variety of ways. The modern world is also a world in which these religious traditions are very much alive.
Okay.
In which these religious traditions have sometimes a prominent place within the public square of a particular country.
Their ethos.
Yeah, sure. They're part of the ethos of our world. So, if you want to be an educated person, it seems to me you need to be religiously literate.
Okay, well, some would argue the opposite, but...
Well, if you want to understand our world and understand how our world comes about or how any given society is shaped and formed, you have to understand the roots that have led to it being shaped and formed the way it is. Many years ago, after a kind of vigorous period of sort of secularization in universities, they had to reintroduce a course on the King James Bible in English departments. Why? Because if you were studying English, if you were reading Dylan Thomas or T.S. Eliot or Jane Austen, Margaret Lawrence, if you're reading any literature, you very quickly discover that the ancient literature of the past is present in the new literature of our day. There are deep echoes and sometimes very direct references. So they discovered in English departments that students no longer, because they hadn't grown up with the Bible and those biblical narratives, no longer really could read literature because they did not have that body of foundational texts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the same would be obviously true in Islamic societies, in India, in China. So my first suggestion is that if you desire in any way to be a reasonably educated person, then you need to understand what the sources are that have made the modern world. Mm-hmm. And one of the sources, I think, go to three places. I sometimes say there are three taproots.
Taproots, okay.
For the modern world. And there is another great source for the modern world. I wouldn't call it a taproot because it's built on these three, but that's the Enlightenment and the 18th century. And the kind of civil ideas that were shaped in the 18th century. So just as you cannot understand democracy, human rights, the rule of law, things of that nature which shape our society, you cannot understand that without having some notion of where that comes from and how it was developed. What were the arguments that went into the shaping of it? So you need to have a grasp of the 18th century. You need to have a grasp of the great sources of religious literature, which also are very much alive, certainly within the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition, very much alive in giving us a sense of what constitutes human dignity and what the human person is. So that's one. But the other one that I think is even more interesting to me, when something has lasted as long as these religious traditions have lasted, it hasn't lasted that long because it was dead. It hasn't lasted that long because it wasn't growing and developing. So these religious traditions are always adding new layers to them. You know, I think I've used this illustration with you before. I think of religious traditions in many ways. I think of culture itself as a kind of onion. It grows by adding new layers. Mm-hmm. But by adding new layers, it doesn't jettison the old layers. Mm-hmm. It grows by adding new layers. So religious traditions, in my view, religious traditions are enormously significant in giving us ways to think about the important questions of life. Now, are there other ways to think about them? Of course there are. But the religious traditions give us extraordinary ways to think about the great questions of life. And those questions are ubiquitous. They remain with us. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be? What does it mean to know? How should I behave? Mm-hmm. Why do I die? What is the meaning of suffering? I mean, these questions are ubiquitous. They're just as ubiquitous now as they ever were. So these traditions are, you know, I'm not the kind of person who's very preoccupied with whether you confess a religious tradition or not. I mean, I'm happy to talk about that and what's the significance of that. I'm not dismissing that. Mm-hmm. But confessing isn't the only issue here. Mm-hmm. One of the issues is literacy. Understanding and having this as something that you can work with. Okay. Because our life is about working with ideas, story. It enhances our capacity to enjoy the world and to live well in the world. So I think that's a huge part of this picture as well. So now to your first question about faith.
Mm. Now some have argued with religion. Some have said religion or accepting a religious viewpoint is actually a sign to be immature or refusing to take on the adult world or entering into reality per se. Some people who are very secular have stated this. It's just childlike thinking, or it's simply the refusal to accept reality. What would you say about that?
Well, this is an old sort of argument, and it's an argument that's perfectly reasonable if we understand what those people think religion is.
Mm-hmm.
My sense is that what they're talking about is superstition.
Okay, go on.
So if you are superstitious,
I.e., I have a rabbit foot,
that's right.
but why would this rabbit foot give me protection if it didn't protect the rabbit?
That's right. Yeah, you got it. So, and is there superstition that kicks around in the minds and hearts of human beings? Well, there sure is. Mm-hmm. And do religious traditions also sometimes become baskets for some of those superstitions? Well, of course they do, mm-hmm. because they're human. But religion isn't superstition. Religion is about an extraordinary, it is an extraordinary body of narratives, of ways of thinking, a whole tradition of thinking, much of which has been shaped precisely to help people overcome superstition, to help people come not to some artificial beliefs about the world, or some crazy beliefs about the world, or some things that clearly are not true, but rather to help you set those aside and to actually come to the place of faith.
So you're saying religion can free oneself of superstition?
It's really the only, I think religion and science are two ways that human beings have had, two methods human beings have had to try and address superstition in their life.
Really? A lot of people would say religion and superstition are two of the same, but you're saying one can liberate oneself from superstition through faith.
I'm saying that if you come to the place of faith, you will no longer be superstitious.
Really?
Because the antidote for superstition is faith. But think carefully about what faith means.
Right.
Faith doesn't mean some theological idea about God's going to protect me or the guardian angel sits on my left shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
Faith is, as I've said to you before, faith is a disposition. It's a disposition of openness to reality.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, I would say that the modern empirical science is a great example of faith.
Really?
Because what is the scientist doing? The scientist is is setting aside all prejudice. Mm-hmm. Well, presumably. The scientific method is an attempt to get rid of your prejudgments so that you can see what's actually happening in the experiment. Well, that to me is a profound manifestation of faith, because it is a heightened awareness of what is unfolding in life. I'm not the only one who thinks this. This is not a new idea with me. W.H. Auden talked about this in beautiful ways, and many, many others have talked about this in beautiful ways. Mm-hmm. So, I once did some work with some astronomers in Hawaii, on the big mountain in Hawaii, where the huge astronomy installation is. And I was asked to come down there and engage them in conversations. So I sat with a dozen of the finest astronomers in the world, who spend their whole life looking back in time. Their whole life looking back in time. Now, my sense was that all of them were formally atheists. Mm-hmm. Formally. But what faith I saw there. And what a sense of wonder and beauty I saw there. These scientists, at the best, they never spent time arguing about whether God exists or not. That wasn't a question for them, really. But when you engage them, I like the God language myself, but it's not part of their world. What is part of their world, however, is faith. That is a disposition of the mind which is open to struggle to see what is real and coming to greet you in the world. So my sense is that the great religious traditions are baskets of knowledge about that fundamental stance of faith, and the accumulation of insight about that, and narrative, which has been helpful to people around that. It's interesting, Derek, that when you look at the age of rationalism, the development of the Enlightenment and the age of rationalism in the history of Western Europe, it's very interesting to me that paralleling the age of rationalism is this huge development of occult thinking.
That's true.
So we have, it's always been striking to me that, and I've known this myself and just in people I know who are hyper rationalistic. Talk with them for a while and underneath it all you'll find superstition.
Very
It's
true.
amazing. And they don't sit very well together as near as I can tell, but it's part of the reality.
Yep. But actually, it's interesting. I've read quite a few biographies and autobiographies, and there's been some famous people who have played around with the occult, and it would be surprising. People you would not expect would be into that sort of thing.
Well, and also look at our world. Look at the modern world, and particularly in countries where religious traditions don't hold sway to any great extent. In those countries, which pride themselves on rationality, pride themselves on reason, a particular kind of modern understanding of reason, because religions are very preoccupied with reason. But the modern form of reason is a very narrow technical kind of reason, tied largely to science. So think of those countries. I mean, I think of France, for example, as such an extraordinary example. What do you, if we look at, say, the development of the French modernist thinkers, and then the French Revolution, and the terror that occurred in the French Revolution. Why did that happen? Why did that country decide that it had to purify itself by chopping off the heads of 17,000 to 40,000 people in 18 months? Well, if you look at that story, if you look at what historians can tell us about it, it's because there was an enormous amount of fear that was going through the country, and consequently scapegoating. Well, that's what happens with. I mean, that's the dark side of superstition. So superstition is ubiquitous. Being a rationalist doesn't make you inert to it. That's not to say it also isn't in the religious communities. You better believe it's in the religious communities. My own sense is that religious communities have some other ways of challenging it and moving people to what I've already described as the stance of faith. And as I said before, my sense is that faith is the antidote to superstition. Well, remember what I said about faith. Faith is actually to see reality, to see what's really going on, and to see it with an openness and a confidence. Superstition is always born of fear, always born of the dark, always afraid of the boogeyman that isn't there.
That is well said.
So faith is the opposite of that.